And I said I was going to talk about modern Protestant objections to it, or concerns, as well as apologetics things. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to summarize in like one sentence the conclusions of the Protestant thing, and then if you have questions, you can ask me. So the main concerns that come from Protestants, I think, are of the form of two doctrines. So there's original sin, which says that we're fallible. We have some are just ordered natures that make us fallible. And there's sola scriptura, which in some sense means scripture alone. Okay? Neither of these are a problem because there's nothing in natural law that requires that we be infallible in our moral conclusions. And it just means that we need to work together across various times and spaces to sort of factor out any mistakes that we would have, or factor out as many mistakes as possible. But like, we're welcome to come up with fallible conclusions, like we do in any other field of investigation. And whatever that's natural, original sin. For sola scriptura, whatever it means, it can't mean that Scripture is the only source of moral knowledge, because Scripture itself references other sources, like conscience. And so you could think of natural law as just a rigorous way of developing what our consciences seek in reality. Those are the short answers. And then, okay, so now we're going to talk about apologetics. I particularly wanted to talk about what natural law means for the moral argument, and what it means for cultural apologetics, or what it means for how we engage with culture. So first, the moral argument. As with most arguments for God's existence, the moral argument isn't a single argument. It's more like a family of arguments. But I think the one that a lot of us are familiar with today is the one given by people like William Lane Craig, which can be stated as follows. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Okay, so the question is, if natural law is true, how does it affect the prospects of an argument like this? Now, Aquinas gave a few arguments for God's existence in various places throughout his writings, although I think the most famous ones are the so-called 5 ways that he lays out in the Summa Theologica. And as far as I can tell, I haven't read all of his writings, but as far as I can tell, he never actually gives a moral argument. Okay? And the reason I think this is the case is because from a natural law perspective, we're seeing that morality isn't some special part of reality that calls out for an explanation, but is rather just the result of otherwise non-moral facts. So the goal-directedness that we see everywhere in nature, and the rationality or the wills of rational beings. Okay. The closest thing that Aquinas would give to, I think, a moral argument is his 5th way, which is a sort of teleological argument. But even as I say that, I feel like I have to qualify this, because the teleology that we've seen, I think, but the teleology that Aquinas has in mind is very different from the kinds of teleological arguments that we have today. So he's not concerned with complexity of living things, and he's not concerned with the fine-tuning of the universe. Okay? For him, we saw that the goal-directedness exists, that this goal-directedness that results from regularities, or that explains the regularities that we see everywhere, exists at all levels of reality, both in complex and in simple. So atoms exhibit the regularity that we were talking about. But the argument raises almost a question, okay? Because there's a question of like how things can be directed towards ends in the way that we seem to have to conclude to because of the regularities. It's clear, at least it's more clear, how intelligent beings, right, can act towards an end. Because in some sense, the intelligent being has the product in his mind before he brings it to existence outside of his mind. And so in some way, the end has an influence over his actions in this way. But with non-intelligent things, like atoms and seeds and matches and things, they lack an intellect, and so their ends can't influence them in the same way. So it seems that non-intelligent things must be directed towards their ends by things that have intelligence. Okay? So Aquinas uses the example of an arrow moving towards its target, and he says, like, it's moving towards its target because an archer pointed it towards that target with the bow. And if we spend more time analyzing intelligence, we would actually see why this is true in like a precise way, but again, I'm not going to go into it. So Aquinas summarizes this sort of sort of part of the argument as follows. He says, now whatever lacks intelligence cannot tend toward an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Although that last bit comes out of nowhere, but because it's like, why would this be called God? There's still a lot to be unpacked in the argument. The way that Aquinas structured his Summa Theologica book, where he puts this fifth way in, is he gives the 5 ways, and then he spends a long time explaining why we would call the being God. Okay, we can't go into that, but at the end of the day, he will then go from these conclusions to just to explain why this being, the supreme intelligence, there's only one of them, why they're good, why they're omnipotent, omniscient, why they're simple, eternal, and like a whole bunch of other divine attributes. But again, we just don't have the time to go into it. So that would be, I guess, the closest thing, because I say the closest thing to moral argument because it's that natural tendency towards ends that we base morality in the first place. Now, I think technically, we can still have the moral argument as I formulated it, but we need to recognize that in some sense it's dependent upon this fifth way, right? So you'd have to say something like, if you hold to something like natural law, then the fifth way applies and God exists. And if you don't, then something like divine command theory would apply and therefore God exists. Right? So that's how you would have to defend the first premise. So it might make that work a bit harder. But I think you can, if you like the formulation of the moral argument, you can still give it. Yeah. Does that make sense? So there's this idea that comes up with natural law, as well as anything else, is that we can do a lot of moral reasoning without making explicit reference to God. But ultimately, like at the fundamental levels, we need God if we're going to be able to have any reasonable moral reasoning. And I think that's the intuition captured in the moral argument. How are we doing for time? Yeah, okay. So then I just want to close with some thoughts on how this affects how we engage with culture. I think natural law is quite nice in this regard because it serves as a common ground for non-Christians and Christians to engage about moral matters without having to first defend sort of the Bible, for instance. Okay. While I think morality ultimately depends on God, natural law gives us the means of arguing about particular moral conclusions without necessarily making reference to God. So, an atheist philosopher called Philippa Foot has said that the Summa Theologica, which is Aquinas' book, is one of the best sources we have for moral philosophy, and moreover that St. Thomas's ethical writings are as useful to the atheist as to the Catholic or other Christian believer. Which is a pretty cool thing to say. And I think this is becoming increasingly important in the Western world, namely that we be able to defend our views, or defend things like human life, family life, and particularly the rights of children. So our culture is increasingly owning the title of the culture of death, where people think it's okay to kill innocent human beings so long as they're young enough or helpless enough, right? Or more generally, where we're choosing to ignore the rights of children because of the desires of adults. And all too often, what I see is people objecting to this, but on what they call religious grounds, which enables the secular world to easily just put them to one side without really listening to anything. So I think there are good arguments apart from any religious confession, and that we need to become increasingly aware and sort of engage with these arguments more. And natural law gives us an avenue in which to do this. And then a secondary point is that natural law can serve to help us show to the culture the almost reasonableness of traditional moral conclusions. And in doing so, we in part show the reasonableness of the Christian worldview as a whole. And so in this way, natural law can help us give our culture, I guess, or can help us show our culture that Christianity is an intellectually viable worldview, contrary to what all the new atheists are saying, and they hype around that. So I think it's quite a nice thing to do because of this. And that's all. That's all I had to say.